Nau mai, haere mai. Welcome to the Pathways College More Than Theology podcast. It's a pleasure to be with you. And for the first time ever, we have three guests with us here today. So I just want to say a massive thank you to all three of you. We've got Mike Crudge, who is the Communications Director at the Baptist Union, based up in Auckland. And we've got Laura Hewett from Christchurch, where it's a little bit cooler than where I am in Tauranga. And Laura is the youth pastor at Riccarton Community Church down there, originally from the US, but now living in New Zealand. And we've also got Jake Mulder from Michigan in the States, and he is the co-author of a book that we'll talk about in just a second. But today's podcast is about a really important topic that is close to the hearts of all three of these amazing guests that we have here today, and that's that New Zealand needs a younger church. So this is in part inspired by the Church Life survey that was brought out recently. And Richard, my colleague, has had discussions on the podcast prior to this about that. And it's also inspired by a call to the New Zealand church from Mike Crudge, who we have here today, to reverse this ageing trend that we're seeing in particular through this Church Life survey, and the call to invest in our young people. So we've got Laura and you, Jake, here today to help us unpack why that's important and what do we do about it. So without further ado, let's dive in. So we've got this incredible book, Growing Young, co-authored by Jake Mulder. And what's fantastic about the work that comes out of the Fuller Youth Institute is that this is based on empirical research into how the church can be more effective in reaching and growing our young people, rather than primarily anecdotal evidence. So a lot of this will translate into our New Zealand context, which I'm sure you'll be able to help us do really well, Laura, having your feet on the ground in Christchurch in the trenches of the all-important and valuable youth ministry. But hey, I'm going to get you guys to introduce yourselves a little bit. So Dr. Mike Crudge, would love to start with you. Do you want to tell us a little about who you are and why you're here?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you. Thank you for the invite to be here as well. Can I just say at the very start that I'm not a youth expert at all, so I'm so thankful that Laura and Jake are part of this conversation, because it's really easy to put the call out that we need to do something about it, but I have zero experience. And apart from having a 7-year-old, which I guess that
Nice.
that helps a little bit. We'll get to that soon. So like you said, I work for the Baptist Churches of New Zealand as the communications director. I've been doing this role for 3 years, and it's kind of trying to help connect the 240 churches that we have across the country in various ways, just keeping an eye on our communication. Before that, I've been a Baptist pastor in 2 pastoral roles in 2 different churches. Been part of Baptist churches for probably about 30 years. And some of my comments about when we talk about the Church Life survey, it's sort of Baptist-centric, but it's kind of, you can go a step higher, and there's a lot of comparison that can be done between the different types of churches, especially the Triple C and Z churches. I actually grew up in Tasman, and when I was a kid, I went to Tasman Gospel Hall, which is now Tasman Church. So that's an Open Brethren Heritage Church. So I kind of slipping into this Pathways podcast with a little bit of history. So a bit of a shout out to Tasman Church, as it's called now. My mum's still part of that church. So
Awesome.
is that enough about me? Oh,
That's fantastic.
one other thing that kind of maybe why I got invited on this podcast. So my research interest has been in communication, but in the relationship between the church in New Zealand and society. So from a communication perspective. So while I've done some theology in church, and I love the church, it's that kind of my postgrad study has been in the area of communication, because I think that's a real crucial part of who we are as Christians and the church. And I think a big part of the gospel is about communication. So that's kind of like the angle that I sit here from.
Great. Yeah, no, it's fantastic to have you with us, Mike. Thank you. Laura, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, my name is Laura Hewett. I grew up in the upper left of the continental U.S., so from Portland, Oregon. Thought that I would stay there forever.
That's very helpful.
Yeah,
Upper
yeah.
left. I like that.
Yeah,
I can
you
kind of
don't need to
picture
know
it.
where the states are when you live here. That's not something you should know. But yeah, that was my context, and I never thought I'd leave there, and ended up wanted to be a high school teacher. Ended up getting a mishmash of degrees in biblical studies, English literature, and a master's in teaching, and then somehow got a job teaching at an international school for missionary kids in Germany. Spent about 10 years there doing life on life kind of ministry in a partial boarding school environment, doing discipleship and mentoring of the kids that I was teaching, and teaching them Bible. And that was a really amazing youth ministry experience to learn lots of different cultural contexts. In the middle of that, I had a sabbatical in New Zealand where I got connected with Riccarton Community Church, and they invited me to come back and be on staff. And just about a year ago, I moved back to be here permanently, open-handed with visas and all that. Lord willing, I'll be here long term. But I just love working with young people. It's so life-giving to me. And I'm honored to be included in this conversation and excited to talk about how we can be purposeful in engaging young people in New Zealand.
Great. Thanks so much, Laura. It's great to have you with us. Jake, from all the way over in Michigan, tell us about yourself and the work you're involved in.
Yeah, thanks, Rosie. Since Laura's already started kind of the helpful explanations, I live in Michigan, so it's the one that looks like a hand or a mitten, kind of in the center of the country, surrounded by water. So
wow.
there's that. Yeah, this topic is interesting, relevant to me for a number of reasons. I had begun the research with my co-authors that led to the book Growing Young when I was in my later 20s, and had no kids at that time. So I was more approaching it as a young adult who had had some very positive experiences connected to the church, but also saw a lot that could be better about the church. And fast forwarding to today, we have a 10-year-old and we have a 7-year-old, or almost 7-year-old. So thinking about the future and present of the church is a relevant topic on my end. But I work for Fuller Theological Seminary. There I serve as a senior advisor to the Fuller Youth Institute, which can share more about later on the call, but we're the organization that guided the research for Growing Young. But then I also function as the assistant chief of leadership formation at Fuller Seminary. So thinking about how we train and form leaders in a variety of different areas. So that's a little bit about me.
Nice. Oh, well, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us, Jake, on your Sunday evening, I believe.
Yep, a little bit behind you.
Awesome.
Looking forward to catching up and seeing what tomorrow has.
Nice. Well, hey, we're here to talk about how that New Zealand needs a younger church. And last year, the Church Life Survey, the most recent iteration of the survey, found that the average age of New Zealand Christians is significantly older than the average age of the New Zealand population. So, in other words, the church is getting old. And if we don't reverse that trend, the church could quite literally die out. So, Mike, we recently had Peter Lynham on the podcast to talk about this survey, and you were invited also to give a response to the study's findings at the survey's launch event. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about the study and what stood out for you?
Yeah, sure. If your listeners haven't listened to the previous episode, pause this one now, listen to Peter Lynham, and then start back at this one. It's very in depth and very helpful. Basically, I loved the idea of this survey, the Church Life Survey. It's like a census, and so it's done every 5 years. And I think this last year it was the most traction the survey has had. And I hope the momentum continues. But basically, it's a little bit like a census that we have. Like last year, we had our New Zealand census as well, which I think is every 5 years. And so it's kind of like a snapshot, except we didn't get everybody. But there's enough data to be able to see a picture, slightly murky picture of what the church is like and what particular local congregations are like and different denominations. So if you imagine starting at the local church level, if you're a pastor or elders or church leadership that got your church to do the survey, which was a 10 or 15-minute survey one Sunday morning. You kind of pulled everyone together and tried to get as many people as possible to answer the questions. What it gave you was this insight into who is sitting there on that particular Sunday who filled out that survey form. And so there's demographic information, age information, but also questions like how often do you read your Bible, and how you like your perception of scripture, whether it's literal or how much context should be considered, that kind of thing. Things like sense of community within a local church. So there's a whole lot of information. Like the Bible reading one, for example. If you were a pastor preaching regularly at your church, if you knew that most of your church people were reading the Bible on their own once a month, compared to maybe 5 times a week, like just that little bit of information alone would change the way that you delivered your sermons on a Sunday morning, I think. So there's really helpful information from a local church perspective. And for Baptists, we've got nearly 240 churches. We had a third of our churches participate, and within those churches, it's about just over 60% of the people that were in them that participated in the survey. So we've got over about 4,700 individuals participated. So we've got quite a good picture. It's not perfect, and you have to consider all those things around it. But it's, like I said before, it's kind of a murky but emerging picture. And the thing that struck me the most was seeing the age distribution, the different age groups, and comparing that with other denominations, and then seeing how that compared with New Zealand society. And it wasn't new information for us, either reading the document or those that were sitting in the room when the information was kind of presented. But it was just so well presented in the survey. And you could kind of see that the different age groups were different colour bands, and what should be middle-aged, that middle-age band, like it's in the name, right, in the middle, it just wasn't in the middle. And it's like this, it's just this creeping line, and depending on what denomination, like Triple CNZ was near the top, being the fairly closely representative of society. I don't think you can be happy with where you're at. There still needs to be some work. Baptists were about 4th in the list, but some of the churches, like the Anglican Church, when you look at their data, it's just so many old people. And like, I don't want to be sound disrespectful, but if we think of, in my mind, when you retire, which in New Zealand is 65 years old, that's kind of a transition point. And so for the purpose of this podcast, let's call old people 65 or older. I can just hear the emails being typed right now, complaining about that. But another piece of information that I was fortunate enough to have on my table at the start of this year, we had a master's student do research on Baptist demographics and data over a 30-year period up until 2019, and using census data and our own stats. And listeners, I'd encourage you to dip into that thesis, whatever denomination you're in, because it shows you what can be done with the information that we have. The student, his name's Andrew Reingold, spelled Reyngoud. It's available online. But what he did, he predicted 10 years into the future using statistical analysis and tools. And this is just for Baptist churches, but he's kind of shown us, if from 30 years of data, he's then predicting 10 years ahead. He's shown us these optimistic and pessimistic scenarios, but it's amazing to see if we do nothing, we're going to get older and older and smaller. And so, for example, you call an aged society when you've got 20% or more over 65, and I think in New Zealand society we've got about 16% over 65 at the moment, but in New Zealand Baptist churches we've got about 25% over 65. All of the churches together in the Church Life survey last year, I think it was about 38% over over 65 years old. And I think it hit Andrew's prediction for Baptist in 10 years' time. It's double what we have now. So it's probably between 38 and 40% over 65 years old. So when you look at the Bell distribution curve of age ranges and stuff, or generational kind of peaks and stuff, like, that's not looking good. And it's kind of desperate times for the church. If we do nothing, if we just continue what we're doing, we are going to get older and older and smaller and smaller. That's just, like, for me, this church life survey is just, it's alarming if we do nothing.
Sure. It's
So
more
that-
than just a reality check.
It is, like, so that was my big take from, that's what I wanted church leaders to hear. That was my I guess I had an opportunity to respond to the survey, and that was it. Like, the main thing, we've got to grow young. And I've got a guy in my office, we call him a youth catalyst, and his name's Ethan. He started talking about this growing young thing. I didn't know at the time that it was referring to your book, Jake, so I hadn't read it, and I have since read it. I thought this was something that Ethan had just invented, but no, you guys have come up with that. And we'll talk about that soon, because it's so important. Like, you guys have done the thinking. Laura, you're doing stuff. I want to hear, how do we grow young? But I feel like my job here is to just raise the awareness of this. The data from this church life survey and from other stuff like the thesis I've mentioned, we need to take that seriously. It's not just people that are thinking, oh, we've got to change, or we're going to, like, end. It is so obvious to me from the data that this is really crucial time to do something.
Wow. Yeah, no, thanks, Mike. Jake, you and the team at Fuller Youth Institute, you have looked specifically at the issue of how churches can grow young. Do you want to tell us just a little bit about that study?
Yeah, absolutely. I can do so. Mike, nice to follow your introduction and some of the message and wake-up call you've given. Having co-authored a book called Growing Young and talking a lot about the church having older and younger people, I've been corrected a few times that the church doesn't have any older people. There are the young and the even younger. So we can do with that what you will, but maybe that'll save some angry letters. So
we can refer to the young who are over 65.
Yes, exactly.
There we go.
That's what I've been told. So again, we're writing and researching out of a U.S.-based context. We think that there's a lot that's applicable and that we can learn. But we were looking 10-ish years ago when we started this research, just over 10 years ago. We had many similar reports coming out in the U.S. A lot of bad news about the church, why the church is in decline, why younger people don't want to be part of the church, that sort of thing, which led a group of us, and my co-authors, Kara Powell and Brad Griffin, to say, well, if we do take that as a reality, that the church is in decline and that we're struggling to engage younger people, then what do we do about it? And those were the questions that we were getting from a lot of pastors and a lot of other Christian leaders who they weren't satisfied with the decline. They were very troubled by it. But their question was, we've tried better games and better pizza parties and all of these things. What's going to get those young people to come back? So that's what really commissioned the research on our end. The short overview, and I'll unpack a few insights, but maybe what I can talk about a little later on is this book has been out for about 8 years, and so there's a lot that we've learned in 8 years of this. But to back up the very brief overview, we wanted to study churches that were not declining and weren't struggling, but churches that were thriving with younger people. So we had talked to multiple denominations, multiple church networks, people who just know thriving congregations, and asked them, who do you know who's engaging teenagers and young adults well? We ended up with about 250 of those churches, and then we studied those churches over a 4-year period through 3 different stages. For those who care about the research, I'll say it real quick, but we ended up doing online surveys with 2 leaders from each of those 250 churches. So first it was surveys. We then narrowed the pool down to just over 40 churches, and we did interviews with people. So actually having phone conversations, Zoom conversations, that sort of thing. And then we narrowed the pool down again to about 12 churches, and we visited those 12 churches. Now, this was a very diverse set of churches. Whatever your impression may be of a thriving U.S. church, if it's a large mega church, we had a few of those churches, but that was by far from the majority. We then analyzed all the research and said there's a whole set of things that are myths. They're the things that people tend to go to of if you want to get younger people to show up, you have to have a super cool pastor, a certain style of worship, or a very large church, or all these things. And we found so many of our churches didn't fit those categories. And then we looked at, well, what do those churches focus on? And keep in mind, this was not primarily talking to adults, asking them, what do you think younger people are looking for? We were talking to teenagers and young adults who are at churches that they love, and we were asking them, why are you part of this church? We ended up having 6 areas that really stood out. If you want me to in a little bit, I can talk about what those 6 are. But we really found what's fascinating to me, those 6 areas aren't, to me, it doesn't feel like rocket science. If you've done a close reading of the Gospels and the book of Acts, I think you would end up with these things. To us, that doesn't mean it doesn't mean anything bad. In fact, we think it means something good. Like if you read Acts chapter 2, and look at what the early church was doing, and then you talk to a bunch of younger people today and say, what do you want the church to look like? They don't just say, I want it to look like Acts chapter 2, but they talk about a lot of things like sharing meals together and doing good in the community and everything. So all of a sudden, we look back, there was something about the church 2,000 years ago that when we talk to younger people today seems to resonate. This isn't about how we get to all these cutting-edge new things that we've never thought about, as much as it is just recovering some very basic things the church was always supposed to be about. So I'll leave it there for now and can unpack different pieces that may be helpful.
Yeah, no, that's really encouraging, Jake, that, churches or congregations that don't feel trendy enough to attract young people, that's not actually what's needed, perhaps. So, yeah, that's awesome. Myself as a mum of a almost 7-year-old like you, Mike, for me, this is of the utmost importance because, I think about my time at church as a young person. I'm not sure if I fit with the youngest of the young people anymore, but knowing that my son and both my sons are going to grow up in a church with a beautiful variety of age and stage, but knowing that I want them to be valued and supported. And I grew up with the phrase, the youth are the future of the church. And I'm not sure if that's a helpful phrase. I think it's incomplete, perhaps. But Mike, your response to the survey was an impassioned plea for the church to reverse this trend of aging. What do you think the church needs to actually do to address this problem?
I do have an idea, but then it's just a high-flying idea. I then need Laura and Jake and you to kind of tell me how
fill in the gap.
Yeah, fill in the gaps.
Yeah.
I reckon we've got there's so much asset, and I'll talk about the Baptist churches, but probably all churches. We've got so much capital asset in buildings and other things, and I reckon we've got this. We need to adjust our investment priorities, kind of like. New Zealand Baptists have about $4 billion of property, and we're not using it all. Some of it, or we're not using it well, or it's in bad condition, or we could consolidate some stuff. So I reckon we've got this model of stewardship a little bit wrong, and that the idea is that if we've had generations, for 100 years, investing in this church building, then we can't, we've just got to keep doing that, or just add to it so that there might be a future investment that comes from it. And so we might, churches borrow money to invest in, and sometimes I hear, this is so that we're going to have a great income from that, because, people are giving less than they're offering. Let's develop a property portfolio that will bring in investment in the future. But the future is 10 or 20 or 30 years' time. which is great. That's the typical Kiwi kind of, that's what we think about our retirement, right? Kiwis love buying property if you can. So the church is just kind of following that in some ways. But in 10 or 20 or 30 years' time, looking at this data, if something else doesn't happen, we'll have an amazing property portfolio for the Baptist Churches of New Zealand, but there'll be no people. And so I'm suggesting we change our stewardship now, a little bit like the prodigal son perhaps, but rather than asking for our inheritance and being spiteful about that and going and partying, let's invest that in growing young. So even I would say let's find out a way to free up a quarter of our assets, say. What would you do with $1 billion over the next decade to intentionally grow young? And this is where Jake and Laura are going to chime in a minute because they'll have ideas. But that's almost, it's too hard to imagine $1 billion in New Zealand. And I would never get that over the line. It would take 10 years just trying to argue about it, in Baptist circles at least. But I can think of near where I live, there is a Baptist church building where there's no congregation anymore. There used to be. It's about half an hour drive away from where I live. It's now being leased, I think, to another type of church, which is fine. But Baptists, we could sell that building and there'd be $4 or $5 million, and we could invest it over 10 years and say, intentionally, how are we going to steward this capital so that in the end, the investment, it looks different. It won't be a church building that has increased in capital value over a decade, but what might we do to invest probably in people? How might that look so that things look different in a decade for the Baptist churches or for any church that decides to move its kind of free up its capital investment over 100 or 200 years and then invest it in something else? So, like, Laura, what would you do if you had $5 million to spend for the next decade?
I would get the biggest, nicest marquee for my Easter camp set up, and I would be able to pay for all the kids who are like in our low socioeconomic brackets to come with full sponsorship. Like, I immediately am thinking of the practicalities when you say you get this money. And I feel really, really privileged that I'm in a church that does actually have a big budget for youth, and I get to have these kinds of events. And so we think of a couple big things that happen through the year, and Easter camp is the biggest one in New Zealand, when you have young people coming to this massive event that's put on, and the youth pastors don't have to plan the speakers. They just have to get there with their young people. They don't have to do the meals. But it is an expensive camp. This last year, I think it cost $240 for like the pre-registrations, and I knew that was going to be a huge hit for our young people. But our church for years has had a bake sale in February that is to raise money to sponsor kids to go to Easter camp. And it's the coolest thing because the young people will do the baking with their small groups together, and then on Sunday morning they show up and they put little like donation prices for, $1 a biscuit, and someone says, how much is it to go to camp this year? And they pay $250 for a biscuit because they want young people to go. Wow. And so that kind of thing is a really cool opportunity to see the rest of the church putting the value into that. But what you're saying, Mike, about we have put our money elsewhere, and instead of going outside of that, I think there's so much opportunity to say our youth events are going to have purpose and value in like two-pronged ways that I think of when I think of spending money. The budget that I have for camps is great and big, and I'm going to use it. But I also would love to be able to resource my young adult leaders who are university students to take their small group kids to Macca's once a week, or to go to hang out and have coffee and do Bible reading together. Those kinds of things are actually where I would say this is investing in layers of the young people in our church, because I have a lot of these university students. Our church happens to have a thriving young adults ministry. We are pretty close to the University of Canterbury. We get a lot of UC students who come and connect with us, and our church has different strategies for engaging them, which are really effective. And then once they are engaged in attending our church, I reach out and try and get them engaged in volunteering with the youth group and in different ministries. But being able to say, we want you to not only be investing in these young people, but to be invested in. And I think that that connects with like the keychain leadership's concept of, if I give you a budget as a youth leader to say you actually are empowered to disciple, like that kind of discipleship for young people that really individualizes the way that we make an impact in the lives of young people. I think there's something really powerful with opportunities instead of just adding another program. Like it's not just about more programming, and that's something I think, echoing Jake, that it's not what we're looking for with finding young people to actually get committed into these churches. It's not about the flash and the show and we did a cool event. Those are great ways to potentially have an introduction to a young person, but that's not what keeps them. I would say, if I was given that much money, I would still have my events. I'm not going to cut them entirely because they do function well for outreach, but the ongoing investment in young people of, I actually care enough about finding ways to disciple you and making sure that that's provided. Like, yeah, just have a meal with them. Even to give a budget for someone to say, you can cook a meal at your home with this money. We'll reimburse you for hosting people, in welcoming the youth group kids into your home for a Wednesday dinner midweek just to hang out. I would love that. I would love that to be an addition in my budget.
Wow. Yeah, Laura, I mean, we've been talking about the Church Life survey, and you're actually on the ground working with youth. What's your take on these findings, and what's your take on the youth of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and why do we need to do something about it?
Yeah, I think just listening to Mike talking about that, and the projection of, if we don't do anything, the church will die. But this is our moment to say we can do something. And man, we have so many opportunities and resources. And I come with such hope for the young people in this country. The teenagers in New Zealand are hungry for something real. The young people they're not satisfied with what culture is offering them. They want something more. And I think there's such opportunity for the church to say, actually, we have something tangible. When we offer you the truth of who Jesus is and what he can provide for you, and we can give you community and belonging and relationship and purpose and value, that is so huge. So to be able to do that, I think, is just a real privilege, first of all. But a lot of times, I think, people of our age in this conversation think that young people just are too disengaged, and that they're not interested in listening to what adults or grown-ups or old people have to say. But they actually are super hungry for something solid, and we have those answers in the church. And one of the things I'm finding in lots of conversations around the city with other youth pastors is that there are so many adults and like the uncles and aunties of Aotearoa that can come alongside these young people and say, like, I don't need to be cool. I'm not your cool older friend. I don't have to fake being trendy. I can just show up and be an auntie to you. I can show up and just be a parent figure, because a lot of our young people are missing one or more parents, which is a devastating statistic. And so for the church to say, actually, we're going to just have the grown-ups be grown-ups and be around the youth group, that's a really valuable thing. I started inviting some of the parents to just be on a monthly roster to literally hang out at youth group, not doing anything like small group wise, but just being an extra dad, to be a mom that can say hello to you and be a safe adult face to recognize when you come into the room. It adds such value. And these parents just didn't realize that that was something they could give that mattered. And I think there's a lot of older people in the church who don't realize that's all these young people want. They want to just have an adult who knows their name and who is excited to see them when they walk in the door. And sometimes we also just separate so much the youth group from the Sunday morning space. I'm trying to get our young people to feel more ownership of our church as a whole, that they don't just come on Friday night is when we have our youth group. They're not just the Friday night group. They're part of the church. We're trying to do this across our different youth ministries and young adult ministries. And so integrating the young people into serving on Sundays is is an option. But I actually think there's such value in finding more of the older people to bring on to Friday night stuff and say, actually, we're all in this together, and it'll encourage the young people to want to be around them more and show up on Sundays, hopefully.
That's awesome. Thanks, Laura. Um, I want to come back to you, Laura, because I love that you've started getting at, I guess, most of the people listening to this are going to want to know, what do we do? Like we've got this picture of what may happen if we do nothing. So I want to dive into, right, what are we, I mean, Jake, you've alluded to these 6 things that you've discovered. So let's dive into that section of our conversation, of what can we do? And Laura, you've touched on a few of these valuable things already. But just coming back to this Fuller study, Jake, what were those key findings, those 6 things in your context that aging congregations need to take on board to grow young?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll give a brief recap. These were kind of the 6 areas of church life that we heard mentioned most. So we have a little diagram that goes around in a circle with arrows. So I'm going to follow that as I explain those. The first one that we talk about is something called keychain leadership. And keychain leadership, really just referring to the idea that if you only have one key, maybe you just carry around that one key. But if you have 2 or more keys, you might hold them together with a keychain or a key ring. And somebody who's been in the church for a longer amount of time, they've likely acquired a number of keys. They have lots of keys that can open different doors. And so keys are physical and literal. They're also metaphorical. Keys represent power and access and authority. So if you're older and you've been in the church for a long period of time, you probably have a lot of keys on your keychain. The question is, for younger leaders who may not have any keys, are more established leaders going to hold on to those keys, or are we actually going to take them off of our keychain and share them with a younger person? So keychain leadership. The second one is the presence of empathy and understanding for younger generations. We heard from a lot of younger people. They don't usually feel like adults take time to step into their world and understand where they're coming from. So churches that are thriving, young people do feel like adults understand who they are and where they're coming from. The third one, taking Jesus's message seriously. I think the good news here is that young people, as young people always have been, get excited about Jesus. That's no different with a younger generation today. They're very interested in who Jesus is and learning from Jesus. So churches that are thriving have a high presence of that, thriving with younger people, I will say. We found that these churches have a warm sense of community. So a lot of young people would talk about, I'm part of this church because it feels like family. It's a place that I'm known. It's a place that I belong. So the relationships were mentioned much more than the preaching or the worship was mentioned. So just think about this for a second. A lot of pastors are thinking about, we want more young people. How do I make the preaching more relevant? How do I make the worship more relevant? How do I make the games more fun? Young people are saying, I want to be part of a church that looks like Jesus, where I'm known and accepted and people care about me. I'm going to bring that point back in a second. The last 2, these churches, they make young people a priority. Okay, so just young people they're not the top priority, they're a top priority. They're not the only priority, but young people are a top priority. And then the last one is that these churches know how to be good neighbors in their community. So a lot of young people say, so many churches are known for the things that they're against. I want to be a part of a church that's known for the things that it's for or the things that it's supportive of. Now, just as a recap of those, there are several of these things that a church can do across generations. A church can take Jesus's message seriously with all generations. A church can have a warm sense of community with all generations. A church can be good neighbors across all generations. And as we've got an assessment tool that we'll do kind of follow-up study with individual congregations, there's a lot of churches that score highly on those 3. They focus on Jesus, they have a warm sense of community, and they're good neighbors. Those are overall healthy churches, but they score very low on these other 3. They share the keys with young people, they step into their shoes and empathize with them, and then they make them a priority. So here's where I want to kind of bring it all together. there's a business or management saying that your system is perfectly designed for the results that you're getting. Okay, like your church, we could say, is perfectly designed for the results that it's getting. I don't know churches too well in New Zealand, so I want to be careful to extend this. But when we look at churches in the United States, we basically see that there is a whole generation of churches that have been designed to focus on Jesus, create a warm sense of community, and be good neighbors, but to do that with an older generation. And the churches are designed to keep doing that along the preferences of an older generation. So much of what we're inviting people into from growing young, it's don't leave Jesus behind, don't leave worship behind, don't leave community behind, don't leave being a good neighbor. Focus on all these things. It's just that churches need to take very seriously the question, what does it look like for us to design what we do in light of there's now a whole younger generation that used to just be teenagers and young adults. Now all of a sudden that's a younger generation up to age in the US 40 or sometimes even 50 that has very different preferences and ways of engaging as compared to a previous generation. So I gave you a little more than you asked for. Those are the 6 areas, and that's a little bit of the implication. I will say I'm especially interested from Laura, given Laura's day in, day out working with younger people in New Zealand. If those 6 don't apply in a New Zealand context, I'd love for Laura to say, the young people here don't care about Jesus or being good neighbors. But Laura, tell us more.
No, they totally do. And actually, it was really interesting. Once I got a copy of this book, and then the youth pastor who I work with, who'd been running this youth ministry for the 12 years before I got here, and they at this church brought me on. And I saw some of this stuff in place as I started reading it. I was like, oh, we do this. This is great. And then I showed the book to Matt. I told him I was reading it. And he goes, oh, yeah, I think our associate pastor used that in his PhD thesis that he wrote on how young people convert to Christianity. Like, it was one of his sources. And when he came on staff, he started promoting these ideas, and we already were using some of them, and we became more intentional with them. So our church, I think, would be one of those ones in your study that would fit all those categories if we've been pretty purposeful with these things. Reading through it as an American now living in New Zealand, there's so many things that each chapter says, like, what does this look like in your context, and being able to evaluate it and having those generalities as you've laid them out. It does fit in New Zealand so perfectly. I think in the actual text, in the chapter of Be the Best Neighbors, is where there's the conversation about racial reconciliation. And when I got here, I had to be sensitive and learn of how does that look different in this context, and with Māori people, and even with Pacifica, like contexts of having lots of minorities that come from Pacific Island nations into a primarily Pakeha congregation. Our congregation is mostly white, but we do have a lot of different ethnicities in our neighborhood, and we want to be purposeful in engaging those people and being aware of what those differences look like in our interactions with each other is really important. And I think we have room to grow in this, but we are being purposeful in it. And I think that's what's important for us to pay attention to, is that we've not ignored the fact that every person matters in our conversations about the gospel. And it's not just the gospel for people who look like us or in our socioeconomic class. And that is something that young people pay attention to, whether they realize it or not. They might be very comfortable in their bubble, but they'll notice what goes on when you, as leaders, interact with people who are different. And Gen Z and Gen Alpha are so passionate about social justice. And so the way that we talk about racial reconciliation in the church and what that looks like in New Zealand to have bicultural values is really, really important. I look forward to learning more about this myself, because it is so important and valuable for us to put that priority on. Actually, we love Jesus enough to recognize racial differences, to recognize hurts that have happened in our country, and how we can still come together, and how we can have progress in advancing the gospel and in loving the marginalized and seeing them flourishing, and all kinds of things that are social justice values that young people have, but actually putting them into practice. One statistic I learned recently in a course I took on youth culture was about how Gen Z is actually so concerned with social justice statements, but they are less concerned with social justice action. And so when we become a church that actually acts on what we say, we're even more impressive to young people, and they're so much more drawn to it. And they're actually excited to have those opportunities to step into something that helps them to follow through on what they say is important in their own life.
Wow. Laura, something that stood out to me in what you shared was that there's been intentionality around growing young for a while now. So what advice would you give a church who perhaps is not so intentional about it, but wants to start getting intentional? What advice would you give them? Like, how do you start? Where do you start?
I think, and this has to be said, you have to pray first to see where God is already working, because I'm pretty sure there are young people in your church that are there, and maybe they're there because their parents are still forcing them and they're the last holdouts. But if you pray about it and you pay attention to what they're saying, you go have a conversation with them and you hear where their heart is at, they will have ideas for you. They might say it to you cloaked in sarcasm, but they might say it to you with a accidental vulnerability, and they are going to be able to tell you what they need. And if you listen to that and engage, and it's what Jake was saying about relationship, if you have that relational connection with a young person, there are some young people in your church, or some young people close by you. And so every church has this opportunity to listen. And I think that's a really valuable starting point, is just listening to what these young people are saying. And I'm an expert at not giving answers to young people. Hopefully I will give an answer in this conversation, but that is actually something that I think is really important for young people to be able to ask some hard questions, and for you to just acknowledge that is a hard question. Man, let's sit with that. Let me think about that. Let me go to scripture, see what that says. Let's read the Bible together and talk about how that influences our understanding of this, and not just wrapping it up with a tidy bow. A lot of young people in New Zealand have experienced various kinds of major and minor traumas that people are trying in the church sometimes to just slap a Band-Aid of scripture on top of really quickly. And that's actually one of the most damaging things to young people that I have seen. Instead, we just need to sit with them and say, I don't have an answer for you, but I have Jesus that we can come together to the church, to the context where we can ask these hard things, and we can find out more about who God is and try and make sense of why this is going on in your life, or why this tragedy happened to you.
I think that's the second core commitment from growing young, is empathizing with young people. Like, I think, Laura, what you've just said are amazing insights into how we might start doing that if we're not. Like, I find that really hard, empathizing with anyone, let alone young people. So thank you.
And I would also add the encouragement that interacting with young people can be awkward at first. And that's okay. Like, that's literally in my pitch to the parents to come be a part of youth group, is this will be awkward. This will be uncomfortable for a couple of weeks while you get to know them. Some of these young people have great social skills. Other ones just will look at you weird, but they're testing you out to see if you're going to stick around.
Wow. Yeah. So what I'm gathering is that relationship is a massive core reason why, or a massive part of what we need to value and invest in. Jake, just jumping back to when you talked about churches who are maybe doing things that appear more trendy, what advice, what encouragement would you give congregations that don't feel big enough, don't feel trendy enough, or even well resourced to attract young people? What advice? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually going to follow on with what Laura already started with. One of my colleagues at Fuller, a professor, he's a leadership professor, Scott Cormode. One of his core principles that he tells to church leaders is that leadership begins with listening. Okay, leadership begins with listening. And for first steps on this whole idea of growing young or engaging younger people, I would actually offer similar advice that leadership begins with listening. And there's, for whatever reason, sometimes a temptation to start really big in the changes that we're trying to make, and we would actually encourage you to start really small. So often when a pastor is hearing what we're talking about, they'll jump to, okay, well, how would I change, our services? How would I change our worship or our teaching? And we would actually encourage that's not the best place for you to start. If you're a smaller church, you might actually be at an advantage because you might have the possibility for depth and relationship, which is in fact what matters. So there was some research done on belonging in churches in the United States. This was done by Springtide Research Institute, and it was done during the global pandemic. And essentially what they found is only a very small percentage of young people in U.S. churches actually had contact from a religious leader during the pandemic. Okay, so a very small percentage of young people in the U.S. had any contact with a religious pastor figure. All of this came out when so much data is emerging that backs up what's always been there. Relationships really matter to young people. They want to be known and they want to belong. So if you're a smaller church, this is where I think a lot of American megachurches really have not helped the global cause. The megachurches have a place. However, many megachurches are great at drawing a crowd. They're not always great at forming a depth of faith. That doesn't apply to every megachurch, but a lot of megachurches are great at drawing a crowd. They're not always great at forming a depth of faith. So there can be this allure of if you want a big church, you become a megachurch. We found so many thriving churches are not megachurches because they know how to do the relationship thing well. So the last piece I would say about that, I'm actually going to give a quick example. We spent some time, my family and I, in Australia. We've been there for a period, a couple different times over the last 7 or 8 years. And we worked with one church that was in Adelaide. And it was a country church, maybe about 80, 100 people. And they were trying to grow young because they realized that they were losing some of their young people. And they had a handful of younger children, but only one teenager. Okay, just one teenager. And so while we were there, we talked to this teenager. We developed a sense of trust with her. And then we ended up interviewing her in front of the rest of the congregation. And she knew this question was coming. So I just want to say it's not that we kind of dropped this on her in front of her whole church at the last minute. But in front of her congregation, I asked her and I said, hey, if you brought one of your friends to this church, how many people would you feel comfortable introducing your friend to? And she said, oh, every single person. I've been at this church my whole life. This church loves me. They care for me. They're all 80 to 100. I would introduce them. And you could just see, the church smile, and there was just this sense of joy of like, great, we're caring for this younger girl. And then I asked a question that I knew was going to break everyone's heart, and I didn't want to ask, but I needed to ask because they needed to move forward. And so I said, okay, well, I want to ask a follow-up question. Let's imagine there was something really difficult going on in your life, and you brought one of your friends to the church. And your friend also had something really difficult, and you needed to talk to an adult that you could trust, that you could be vulnerable with, that you really felt like you could be fully honest with this adult. And I said, how many adults in the church would you feel comfortable talking to about that? And she paused for a minute, and you could tell she did not want to break her church family's heart. But she was honest, and she responded, and she said, maybe one. Maybe one. And you could just feel the collective heartbreak in the church at that moment because they realized this disconnection between she felt generally at home and accepted and loved, like in a general sense, but not to the point that she could be fully honest, fully herself, and bring something really difficult. And I think the question and her response is actually the question of a lot of young people right now. Like, they're very interested in Jesus. They want to see great things happen in the world. They want to be known. They want to be honest about so many things that are happening inside. They've got a church family who's like that's around them and cares about them. But at least from that younger person's standpoint, they might not feel the ability to fully be honest and vulnerable. To me, that's a collective gut check to say, well, when people are around Jesus, I mean, people felt the ability to be fully who they were and honest and loved and supported and challenged. I think that might be part of the question that I would put in front of any church in New Zealand is pick one young person. I don't even pick like just pick one and get to know them and listen to them and hear what's in their heart and what God is doing in their life, and try and get to that point of trust where anything that was going on in their life, anything, they would feel like the place to go of people who modeled Jesus, who they could be fully honest with, it was their church. I think that if the church in New Zealand was able to do that, I don't think you'd be able to keep young people out of the church. I mean, you would have a problem that there would be far too many young people just flooding into the churches that you wouldn't know what to do with them. To me, those aren't, American or Australian or New Zealand. Those are just like some human realities of truth, acceptance, Jesus, those things. So anyway, that's just one example of don't try and change everything. Don't try and reach 1,000 young people. Just really start and understand the perspective of one and let it kind of flow out from there.
Wow. Thanks, Jake. Just before we wrap up, Laura, do you want to jump in and add in anything on that
just
for us?
to build on that and follow up, like this this group of young people, this generation of young people are so hungry. They really do want to have these conversations about Jesus, and they really do want to have just life conversations. They just want life support from adults in life, and it's such a cool time, because I really do have amazing hope that we can really shift the trajectory of where the church is going in New Zealand and just see an absolute turnaround. And I just am excited that there are people who want to have this conversation, who recognize how important it is that we be purposeful in reaching out to young people, because it's not going to happen by accident for sure. But these young people want it, and they will respond. And I'll just share a story. I've been sharing this every chance I can get in the last few months. We had a split night in our youth group where we did the juniors went off site and did an activity. And I was with the seniors were off site. I was with the juniors. And so we had year 9, 10, 11, or only 9 and 10. It was just year 9 and 10. So these are the kids that are actually Gen Alpha. They're not Gen Z. And I was we'd started integrating spiritual practices into youth group as something that if they need to learn them somewhere. So let's do it at youth group. And I highly encourage that, because these are practices that have held up for a couple thousand years at this point. And we were going to do solitude, and I was doing solitude with Gen Alpha. And I was admittedly nervous of how this was going to go down with a group of 12 and 13-year-olds. How are they going to respond to the most mature 14-year-old even getting involved in doing silence and sitting in the quiet? So I had a room of 27 young people and a handful of leaders. And I said, we are going to sit in silence for 2 minutes. I'm going to set a timer on my phone. We're going to not speak. We're going to be totally quiet, and we're just going to spread out around the room, and we're going to be in God's presence. And it is going to be awkward and uncomfortable for some of you, and that is okay, because the point is to be in God's presence. And I prepared them for it to go poorly, because I foolishly expected it to go poorly. When we came back together after the 2 minutes, I asked them, I said, raise your hand if you thought that was awkward and uncomfortable. And one hand went up. And to his credit, this kid comes from a non-Christian home. He has not made any faith declaration, but he's been fully involved in our youth group activities, and he participated. He didn't put up a fight, and he just did it. And it was awkward. And I was like, fair enough. And then I said, okay, how many of you just thought it was boring? Just giving him that range of, it wasn't awkward, but it was boring. And literally no one raised their hand. And I said, How many of you just liked being in God's presence for 2 minutes? And every single hand in the room went up after that. Like every other kid and leader put their hand up and just liked being in God's presence for 2 minutes. And I just was really struck by the fact that this is a generation that we're told they're so distractible, they can't get off their phones, but they were hungry. They sat in God's presence for 2 minutes and they loved it. And one of the kids the next day told his youth leader afterwards that he loved it so much, he just like climbed a tree in his backyard and sat there for half an hour in God's presence because it was such a profound and powerful experience to have those 2 minutes in God's presence. And so these young people, I want us to have that hope that if we give them the tools, they will run with it. They are hungry and they are excited. And it just has to be a hey, let's sit in God's presence for 2 minutes, or hey, let's just have a conversation about where you're at. And I'm not going to give you answers. I'm not going to solve all your problems, but I'm going to walk beside you through this journey of life.
Wow. Well, bless you, Laura, for the work that you're doing down in Christchurch. It's truly inspiring, and it's so awesome to hear and have practical, tangible, relational ways that we can be intentional about investing in our young people. So thank you. That's extraordinary. That's beautiful. Jake, thanks also to you, for what you've shared, and for all the work, the years of work that went into this book, but also the years of ongoing work that's been done since then, and for sharing your passion and your advice. And Mike, it's been fantastic to have you with us as well. And I'd really like to ask you to pray for us as we finish, to pray for all those who are listening, to pray for the Church of Aotearoa, and yeah, just to end our time in prayer. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, it'd be my pleasure. Thanks, everyone. Let's pray. God, we pause now after a lot of talking, and we pause to intentionally, again, direct our thoughts to you, particularly on this topic of growing young within our churches. We ask you to guide us, prompt us, show us what we need to do, how things like the 6 core commitments from growing young can help our local churches and ultimately our denominations and ultimately our societies. Those that are listening, may you inspire them. If they're leaders of young people, youth group leaders, youth pastors, but also senior pastors, people like me that aren't involved in youth work or ministry, may you cause us to be so concerned with the future of the church that we do all that we can to grow young. We ask for this guidance by your Spirit in Jesus' name. Amen.
Ngā mihi nui. Thank you so much, all 3 of you, for being here with us today. And thanks everyone else for joining us on this podcast. We'll catch you in the next one. Ka kite anō.
Great to be with you. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.